So here's a painting from a few years ago with my grandfather, Ned Edgar Benton Isham, with the white hat and the light-colored suit, seated opposite his friend Mr. Toomey. They're on the beach. Lake Michigan is behind them. Part of my intention was to celebrate the idea of friendship as being the great treasure of life, and also a kind of parable that points to the relationship that we are invited to have with God. So I'm going to put the painting down, sort of big and awkward, and I'd like to hold up a little photograph in a moment. So here's the little photograph, and you can see that they're actually up on high ground off to the left. If the foliage wasn't there, you would be able to see Lake Michigan. Besides Mr. Toomey, there's also Mr. Hunter on the left. He comes into the story a little later. But this is late in Ned's life, and they're living in Michigan City, Indiana, and the hills are actually referred to my father as sand dunes, but obviously stable enough to build on. And the Isham home and perhaps the Hunter home nearby, and maybe some other homes nearby that are the residence of other members of the little fellowship that was there at the time, the little Brethren Fellowship. Ned Edgar Benton Isham was born on the 1st of April, 1873 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to Florence, his mother, and Frank Isham, his dad. 7 years later, in the 1880 census, Frank is listed. Strangely, he's also listed somewhere else, but that comes into an earlier video. And Florence, of course, and young 7-year-old Ned. There's also a boarder, Edward Webb Jenks. So we have this picture in 1880 of Ned saying goodbye to his father for the last time. Whether he realizes that and the full extent of the pain and bewilderment that might have been there for a young boy, we'll never exactly know. But the boarder recorded there, staying with Frank and Florence, ends up marrying Florence in 1883, 3 years later. By all accounts, it was a much happier time both for her and for young Ned, who had great respect and admiration for his stepfather, who is actually commemorated in the name of his first son, my father, Edward W. Isham. So there was the endearment and the high regard was reflected in naming my grandfather, Ned, naming his own son. Now, I don't really have a window into Ned for quite a few years. There's no census in 1890 because most of the census forms were destroyed in a fire, apparently. But in 1900, Ned is recorded as a 25-year-old. Actually, I think he was closer to 27, so there's a flaw there. He's recorded as a book salesman, and he's living with his mother, Florence, and his stepfather, Mr. Jenks. So he's still living at home, young man selling books. I have a photograph. I'm just going to grab it. There we are. There's young Ned, maybe closer to 20 if I had to guess. But there he is as a young man. And then, so that was the house on Magnolia Avenue that I actually visited, but I tell about that in an earlier video. And so in 1903, not long afterwards, he's met and married Cora Fowler Hunter. Now the Hunter, young lady named Hunter, the last name has no connection to the Mr. Hunter, the friend. It's a different family. Coincidence. And there's a story that the way they met, that Cora is traveling on a Chicago streetcar with her mother, and they maybe have a flyer in their hand that tells of a meeting or an event organized by the Brethren group, and they're on their way, and Cora spots a young man toward the front of the streetcar, and she says to her mother that she thinks that young man is likely going to the same meeting, some kind of hunch. And her mother is not very keen on the idea of following this young man as Cora has suggested, but they do follow him. And the comment is that Cora says she then follows him for the rest of her life. So married in the 6th of May, 1903. So we come across them then in the 1910 census. There are 4 children. The eldest is Edward, who's 6, my father, and the youngest, Timothy, is a 6-month-old baby. And he's listed as a clerk and out of work, living in Chicago and out of work. Interestingly, there's a young Swedish maid recorded there, so even if the income has been cut off from the family temporarily, may have been a short, may have just caught him between jobs, but they have the means to support this young Swedish maid. And it's interesting that although it's not the same woman, there's another Swedish maid that appears in helping the family, the Ishams and the Hunters, who are living in proximity in Michigan City later on, and she lives out the rest of her life with helping, working for the families. So I'm not sure what it is about Swedish maids, but there's a couple of them in the story. The census form asks about, were you out of work in the previous year, in 1909, and or Ned, I should say, Ned says, records that a couple of weeks he was out of work. In 1914, we know that Frank spent a couple of Ned spent a couple of years in, not a couple of years, maybe a couple of weeks, a short time in Dallas, Texas. So he took a trip down to Dallas, and that's recorded on the flyleaf of this book. Now the book, I think, is by Mr. Raven, although it's only his initials that are in the book, but I'm pretty sure it is. who was a man among the brethren that my father had very high regard for. And obviously, his father, Ned, Edgar Benton, had his name embossed on the leather cover of the book, indicating how much he valued the book. So perhaps he was looking for work briefly down in Texas, and then on the other page over here, 10 years later, he's recorded his address, written his name again and recorded his address. There's a couple of messages from my father, who often left little notes for me to call attention to things. I like this one. Actually in Malibu Beach. It's only a couple of years old then. And he says to me, "Be faithful unto the end, my son." I hope I can fulfill that. Okay, so little treasure from Edgar Benton's past that tells that he made a trip to Texas probably looking for work. We next find him in Chicago. Actually, the family's in Michigan City. They've moved there. And so in order to work in Chicago, Frank needs to stay in a hotel. And my father also did likewise, living during the early part of his unmarried life, living in hotels in Chicago and commuting home, spending at home on the weekends. But here's Frank doing that, Ned doing that. We've got him recording some notes on the book of Nehemiah on the Congress Hotel stationery. Congress Hotel was built in conjunction with the Columbia exhibition. So it's a grand old hotel with a grand lobby and entrance and accoutrements and interesting place to look up. So we can picture my grandfather in these days as an accountant. My father talks about him perched on a high stool in that sort of almost caricatured manner, with a green visor on his forehead, over his eyes, totaling up a long line of figures, which my father said he could do very quickly. A lot of the tasks of bookkeeper and accountant and general number-related things related to business were not automated. There were not machines to do that work, and there was a lot of just very hands-on, direct kind of engagement that we don't have today. Picture Frank coming home, or Ned coming home from work, and here on this occasion he's made some notes about Nehemiah. And the notes are mainly about Nehemiah's exploration of the ruins. He's come back exploring the ruins of Jerusalem and clambering over the fallen rock, leaving his beast behind. And then right at the end, there's a little paragraph that caught my attention. It looks like that, but I have it. No, there's the page. It's coming apart. I need to assemble it. But there's the page. And he says, I've copied it out so I can read it more readily. This was a feeble and small start, Nehemiah's assessment of the ruins, but the beginning of a great movement, which was to go on to the coming of the Lord. And what I like there is Ned's overarching vision of the progress of the narrative of Scripture and culmination in the Lord, in Jesus. we see him still commuting from Michigan City to Chicago, and there's a letter from a different hotel, the Palmer House in Chicago, and he says, "My darling," this is in 1919, a couple of years later, signed Ned at the end, the nickname that he used. Also thinking of my grandson by the same nickname. And again, I'll look at my copy, more easily read. That second paragraph, he says, "We step aside from the course of things." So from the accountancy, from the daily nub of life, to and fro, mundane of life. We step aside from the course of things and abide in the glorious center and sun of that coming world. And our hearts are in motion. A beautiful phrase. Our hearts are in motion on account of the anointing. We are kings and priests. Ned. So it's a lovely letter. I like that a lot. The next bit of information that emerges is, as best I can figure, 1920. It's not actually dated, but it's the draft registration, and it looks like a little strange because World War I finishes in 1918, but he's still being asked for information, and he's 45 years old, which I think is very close to the break-off point. After 45, you're not subject to the draft. So he was right on the edge of things in a couple of different ways. It has him recorded working for the W.P. Rend Corporation, which might have still been in Chicago, although I'm inclined to think maybe it could have been the wholesale coal merchant that we know that Ned was working for a wholesale coal business in South Bend, which is much closer to home, much closer to Michigan City, and it was an industrial city, and undoubtedly coal was in huge demand. So that could have been. He's recorded as tall. I think my father said 6'4", but very, very tall. Blue-gray eyes, black hair. And I think that's about it from the draft registration. So there's one more item, and this gets right at the end of Ned's life. And this is a letter from Mr. Hunter, the one in the picture at the beginning, or the one that I left out of the painting. And it's a very heartfelt, beautiful letter written to a friend, and really not moment by moment, you could almost say hour by hour account of the final days of Ned and his regard for Ned. Now, I'd have to say, in talking about Mr. Hunter, that he's an ambiguous figure, and it would be pretty clear from comments that my mother made and from my Uncle Ben that he was a tyrant as well. There was an element in his personality that was overbearing and iron-fisted. My father, in fact, who called him his best friend and had such admiration in his comments for Mr. Hunter, ended up annotating his notes in a notebook saying that Mr. Hunter, I think the word was mercilessly, drove out his sister Florence and brother Timothy, who both left home early, and was an overbearing man. But by contrast to that, what Mr. Hunter says about Ned is rather beautiful. So I've got it again in a form that's a little bit more legible to me. And he talks about, for example, Ned's contribution to their little assembly, a little gathering of Christians, and his final one being related to the book of Daniel and the subject of prayer. And he talks about freshness, sweetness, and liberty. Now, Ned, his condition was not clear at the beginning. The diagnosis was confused, but it turned out that he had an not curable, inoperable blockage of the major artery to his small intestine. So that led to a very, very painful and you could say ugly death. But surrounded by love, Mr. Hunter talks of friends coming from Chicago and far and wide to be with not only Ned in his closing hours, but also at the funeral. And what I'd like to read from this is the final paragraph, where it says, Mr. Isham was a very reticent man, and few knew and understood him. But we who were privileged to intimately know him bear witness to the fidelity and devotedness of this beloved man, who loved the Lord, the assembly, and the truth so deeply. And precious were the fruits of ripened knowledge and love in him, which appeared in power in his closing days. So there we are. There's Mr. Hunter's letter. Here's a picture of great-grandfather Ned at the end of his life, near the end of his life. And I think I will leave it there.